"Sit down and shut up." The flight attendant's voice cut through the cabin like a whip, sharp and full of disdain. Before the pregnant woman could respond, a hand flew through the air. Smack! The sound echoed, brutal and sudden. Her head snapped to the side, a red mark blooming across her cheek. Gasps rippled down the aisle. A phone camera and A blinked silently. The cabin froze in stunned silence. The woman said nothing. She just sat there, trembling slightly, hand cradling her cheek, her eyes wide. Not with fear, but with something colder. Resolve. "You people always think you're entitled," the flight attendant sneered, stepping back with her chin high. "First class doesn't mean you." What she didn't know was that the woman she just slapped was married to the man who owned the airline. The Aura Air Celestial Lounge at JFK was designed to feel like a sanctuary, a pause button pressed in the chaos of transatlantic travel. Smooth jazz trickled through the air like warm honey, weaving between the clink of fine porcelain and the hushed murmurs of executives in tailored suits. But to Dr. Simone Monroe, none of it registered. Her fingers, long and steady from years in surgery, rested lightly on the curve of her belly. 6 months into a pregnancy that had been as emotional as it was miraculous. Her phone buzzed again. Another message from her sister in London. "Dad's stable for now, but he keeps asking for you." That was all it took. That one sentence was why she'd packed a bag in 15 minutes, kissed Marcus goodbye over video call, and raced to the airport like time itself was collapsing. Normally, Simone planned every trip down to the last detail. But not today. Today was about getting across the Atlantic as fast as possible to sit beside her father's hospital bed. A decorated pediatric cardiologist, Simone was used to delivering calm, composed updates to families in crisis. But being on the receiving end, this helpless, suspended state, was foreign and brutal. Her husband had seen in her eyes, even over a screen. "Go be with him, Eve," he'd said, using the nickname he reserved for moments when she needed grounding. "I'll handle San Francisco. I'll close the deal, and I'll reroute to London the second I can. Aura will take care of you." Aura, his life's work. The airline he had built from a one-plane charter into a luxurious boutique brand with first-class cabins that felt like five-star hotel suites. Every stitch of leather, every thread count, every wine-all list had Marcus's signature. He lived for this company, and Simone had always felt that when she flew with them, cradled in a space designed with care. But today, none of that mattered. The luxurious lounge might as well have been a bus terminal. All she could think about was her father and the hours that stretched between now and Heathrow. She walked slowly toward the gate when her name was called for priority boarding, clutching a small travel pillow and silently begging her nausea to hold off just a little longer. Morning sickness, persistent and punishing, had followed her past the first trimester like an uninvited ghost. She was ushered into 1A, her favorite suite in a first-class cabin, though she barely noticed the familiar plush leather or the monogram blanket folded neatly at the side. The moment she sank into her seat, her body melted in exhausted relief. She closed her eyes, but peace was a luxury she wouldn't get today. "Ma'am," came a clipped voice, sharp as a paper cut. "I'll need to take your coat and stow your handbag for takeoff." Simone opened her eyes to see a flight attendant. Name tag, Karen Miller, standing stiff and upright, her uniform pristine, her smile brittle and unconvincing. Simone had encountered many flight attendants in her life, but this woman's presence was less hospitality, more enforcement. "Of course," Simone said, her voice soft. "Would it be possible to get a bottle of water before we depart? I'm feeling a little unwell." Karen's eyes flicked to her stomach, then back up, unreadable. "We begin beverage service once we reach cruising altitude," she replied, smile fading like steam off a mirror. Simone nodded, trying not to bristle. "Understand," she said carefully. "I'm pregnant, and I'm just feeling a bit dehydrated. A bottle of water would really help." But Karen wasn't budging. "The rules are for everyone's safety. All items must be stowed. All passengers must remain seated until the captain says otherwise. I'll see what I could do later. She took Simone's coat and bag and turned away. It was a small exchange, one most passengers might shrug off. But to Simone, it felt like a subtle message. Not just no, but you don't belong here. She pressed her head back against the seat, studying her breathing. Maybe it was just stress. Maybe the woman was having a rough day. She told herself not to take it personally. As the plane taxied toward the runway, the safety video began to play. One Simone had seen before, featuring a familiar face that always made her smile. Marcus, mid-speech, explaining seatbelt protocols and sleep pod settings with his usual quiet charm. She reached for her own belt and tried to secure it across her belly, but didn't sit right. Too low, too tight. Her baby shifted uncomfortably. Simone remembered how, just weeks ago, a friendly attendant on a flight from Baltimore had provided her with a seatbelt extender without hesitation. She searched for the call button, but Karen was already walking down the aisle. "Excuse me," Simone said gently as Karen approached. "Could I please get a seatbelt extender? This one isn't safe during pregnancy." Karen stopped, looked down. Her eyes narrowed. "Ma'am, you need to be properly secured for takeoff. That's how the belt is supposed to fit." Simone kept her voice calm. "I'm a doctor. I understand the design. But in pregnancy, pressure across the lower abdomen can be dangerous. An extender allows me to place it safely under the belly." Karen's jaw clenched. "We don't just give them out because someone finds the belt uncomfortable. They're for passengers of size." The insult was subtle, but it landed like a blow. Simone's hands gripped the armrest. "This is about safety, not vanity," she said. "And your airline policy clearly supports pregnant passengers requesting an extender." Karen's voice rose. "In my 20 years of flying, I've never had someone make this an issue." Her tone sliced through the air like a scalpel, drawing curious glances from nearby passengers. Simone tried one more time. "Then please speak with the captain. We're another crew member, but I'm not compromising my child's safety." Something in Karen snapped. "I'm the authority here," she spat, leaning in, her face inches away. "You'll sit down, you'll be quiet, and you will not speak to me that way again." Simone blinked, stunned. The air in the cabin grew thick. She stood, or tried to, the motion awkward with her growing belly. "I will not be spoken to this way," she said, her voice shaking with restrained fury. "I am a passenger, and you are." But she didn't get to finish. The slap came out of nowhere, a sharp, vicious crack that echoed through the cabin like a gunshot. The cabin froze. Simone stumbled back, hand to her cheek, the sting spreading through her skin like fire. Across the aisle, a woman gasped. Into a young man who had been quietly filming now captured the moment in full. Karen's expression twisted with shock, horror, and then something else, defiance. She had crossed the line so violently, so publicly, that there was no return, but she still didn't know the truth. The woman she had just slapped wasn't just a passenger. She was the wife of the man who built this airline. The woman whose safety she had just disregarded was married to the CEO of Aura Air. And Karma, it seemed, had already boarded this flight with a front row seat and a long memory. The cabin remained frozen, a silence so thick it felt like a second skin. Simone didn't move. Her hand hovered near her cheek, not quite touching it now, almost like she was trying to separate herself from what had just happened. Her mind registered everything in rapid, clinical fragments. The tingling heat of skin just struck, the pressure shift in her belly from the sudden jolt, the dry taste in her mouth. But above all, there was a stillness inside her, the kind that doesn't come from shock alone, but from something far older, something honed in rooms full of doubters, colleagues who underestimated, in a world that rarely made space for women like her to speak, let alone be heard. Karen still stood in the aisle, breathing heavy, fists clenched so tightly her knuckles had blanched. She seemed to realize, a beat too late, that her outburst had crossed the line. But rather than apologize, she doubled down straightening her posture like a soldier caught mid-defiance. Passengers must remain seated for takeoff, she snapped, her voice loud and clipped, hoping to reclaim control through volume. If you cannot comply with flight safety procedures, I'll have to notify the captain. In 2A, Liam's phone stayed propped on the tray, its lens still capturing everything. His eyes darted to Simone, to Karen, and back, unsure whether to intervene or keep recording. Behind him, a few heads had turned. One woman whispered something to her husband. A businessman 2 rows back lifted his eyebrows, but quickly buried his face in a magazine, pretending he hadn't seen anything. Simone slowly turned her head, locking eyes with Karen, not with rage, but with a gaze so steady, so cutting in its quiet composure, that Karen visibly flinched. Simone spoke clearly, each word deliberate, like she was building a case. You assaulted a pregnant passenger, on camera, in front of multiple witnesses, and now you want to invoke protocol. Her tone was razor thin, professional, lethal in its restraint. Get the captain, now. Karen hesitated, just for a second, then turned abruptly and stormed toward the cockpit, her heels striking the aisle like a gavel. The moment she disappeared, a hushed ripple passed through the cabin. Liam leaned forward slightly. Ma'am, he said quietly, I got all of that. I don't know if it helps, but it's all on video. Simone glanced at him, nodded once, and offered the faintest trace of a thank you. Her voice was calmer now, but her body trembled with adrenaline. The captain arrived moments later, a man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair and a warm, measured demeanor that suggested decades of navigating turbulence, both literal and human. He approached Simone directly. Ma'am, he began, I'm Captain Rhodes. I understand there's been an incident. Before she could answer, Karen reappeared behind him, interjecting quickly. She refused to follow safety procedures and became combative. I had to intervene. Captain Rhodes raised a hand, signaling her to stop. Let's hear from the passenger, he said firmly. Then he turned to Simone, his voice softening. Can you tell me what happened? In your words. Simone took a breath, her voice steady. I asked for a seatbelt extender due to my pregnancy. She refused. I reminded her of airline protocol. She raised her voice, got in my face, and when I stood up, she slapped me. There was no drama in her delivery, no exaggeration, just facts, clear and undeniable. The captain looked from her to Karen. Then Liam raised his hand slightly. Sir, I record the whole thing. From which she asked for the extender until he didn't finish. He didn't need to. The implication hung there. Captain Rhodes's expression shifted, just slightly, but enough. A wrinkle of disbelief, a flicker of something like disappointment. Then protocol kicked in. He turned to Karen. Go to the galley. Wait there. I'll speak with you in a moment. Karen opened her mouth to object, but the tone in his voice left no room. She left without another word. Simone sat back, exhausted. Her hand rested instinctively on her belly again, a protective gesture that came as naturally as breathing. Captain Rhodes crouched slightly to her level. We're still the gate, he said quietly. Would you like to deplane? We can arrange another flight, or a medical check, or whatever you need. Simone shook her head. No, I need to get to London. My father's in the hospital. The captain nodded. Understood. I'll ensure you're looked after from here on out. And just like that, the hierarchy shifted. The moment moved. Karen's authority, built over decades of routine, control, and unchallenged assumptions, collapsed in under 10 minutes. But she still had no idea who Simone really was. Not yet. The truth hadn't landed, but it was circling, waiting to descend. The cabin slowly resumed its muted rhythm. The intercom clicked on. The captain's voice, calm and composed, announced a short delay due to a personnel matter being addressed. Simone leaned back in her seat, eyes fixed on the window, not really seeing the tarmac outside. Her heart was still racing, her cheeks still warm, but it wasn't the sting of the slap that lingered. It was the unmistakable weight of being rendered invisible. Again, the Despite the credentials, despite the ticket, despite everything, the seat that was supposed to be a cocoon of calm had turned into a stage, and Simone, against her will, had been thrust into the spotlight. Behind the scenes, the ripples were spreading. In the cockpit, Captain Rhodes had already pulled up the flight manifest. As he typed Simone's last name into the crew portal, something clicked into place. Her full name, Dr. Simone Monroe Thorne. Thorne. His eyes narrowed. He leaned over to his co-pilot. "You recognize the name Marcus Thorne?" The younger man nodded. CEO. Founder of Aura Air. The captain's jaw tensed. And Karen just assaulted his wife. No more needed to be said. The wheels were now in motion, slow, quiet, precise. Meanwhile, back in first class, Liam discreetly airdropped the video to himself and backed it up to the cloud. "Just in case," he muttered. The woman seated behind Simone leaned forward gently, her voice soft with concern. "Are you all right, dear?" Simone nodded once. "I will be." The woman didn't pry, just rested a hand briefly on Simone's arm, a gesture of quiet solidarity, before leaning back again. In the galley, Karen stood with her arms crossed, staring down at her shoes. She didn't need a mirror to know how red her face was, or how wrong the situation had gone. She'd expected the captain to back her. She was senior crew, respected, feared even. But now she could feel the shift. The authority she wore like armor suddenly felt like it had holes. And the worst part, the woman hadn't screamed, hadn't cried, hadn't threatened. That calm, steady voice, that unnerved her more than anything. It wasn't a reaction of someone you could dismiss. It was the kind of stillness that precedes something bigger. A chime rang from the front. A ground operations manager stepped aboard, holding a tablet. He conferred briefly with Captain Rhodes before approaching Simone directly. "Dr. Thorne, I'm very sorry for what's occurred. I've just spoken with our executive team. We'd like to extend every possible courtesy to you. Is there anything you need before departure?" Simone looked up, surprised. "No, thank you. I just want to get to London." The man gave a short nod, then stepped back. But that one exchange was enough. Enough for Karen, still watching from the galley entrance, to feel the ground shift beneath her. She had assumed this passenger was just another entitled woman playing up her pregnancy for perks. But now she wasn't so sure. She slipped back in a first-class cabin, keeping her distance, glancing toward Simone, who didn't return the look. Karen's eyes scanned a seat back in front of her, then the name on the manifest. Monroe. Thorne. The surname hit like cold water. Thorne, as in Marcus Thorne, her boss's boss. The man whose name was whispered like legend among airline employees. The man who personally designed the first-class experience she just desecrated. Her stomach turned, and for the first time in years, Karen Miller didn't know what to do. 20 minutes into the flight, the fasten seatbelt sign clicked off with a soft chime, and flight attendants moved into action. Another crew member, a younger woman named Heather, approached Simone cautiously. "Dr. Thorne," she said quietly, "I just wanted to personally apologize. I wasn't on duty during boarding, but I reviewed the incident and..." She hesitated. It never should have happened. Simone offered her a brief nod. Heather didn't linger. She simply left a bottle of water, an extra blanket, and a fresh seatbelt extender on the table beside Simone's seat before stepping away with practiced grace. Karen watched all of it from a galley. Every move, every gesture. Her chest tightened. No one had spoken to her since takeoff. No comms from the captain. No acknowledgement from the other flight attendants. She was isolated, floating through her own aircraft like a ghost. Her fingers fidgeted with the edge of her perfectly folded scarf, her composure cracking around the seams. 35,000 feet in the air, the atmosphere had shifted completely. Passengers in first class had picked up on the undercurrent, the glances, the murmurs. No one said anything outright, but everyone felt it, especially when a message pinged on Liam's phone in two-way. He glanced at it, then did a double take. "No way," he muttered under his breath. He leaned forward and whispered across the aisle, "You might want to see this." Simone looked up, curious. Liam turned the screen toward her. It was a press release just published. The photo at the top. Marcus Thorne standing beside the Aura Air logo at a press conference in San Francisco, arm extended as he sealed a multi-million-dollar merger with a major European aviation group. Below the image, in bold letters, Aura Air, SIL. Marcus Thorne confirms transatlantic expansion, in flight with executive family today. Simone's eyes narrowed slightly. They published the article. Liam nodded. "Just now. Looks like you're not exactly traveling under the radar anymore." Simone smiled faintly, her fingers resting again on her belly. "That was never the plan. Just bad timing." Liam grinned. "Or perfect timing, depending how you look at it." Unbeknownst to them, the captain had received a message of his own, a secure company communication, marked urgent. He opened it, skimmed quickly, then tapped a private number into the cockpit phone. After a short exchange, he emerged from the cockpit and walked back into first class. He didn't address Simone this time. Instead, he stopped in front of Karen Miller, still stationed awkwardly near the galley. "Ms. Miller," he said firmly, "you are relieved of duty for the remainder of the flight. You will not engage with any passengers. You will remain seated in the rear jump seat and surrender your access badge until we land." Karen's jaw dropped. "What? Captain, But the captain held up a hand. "That is not a discussion. This decision comes directly from Aura's executive office." He lowered his voice slightly. "From the founder himself." Karen's face went pale. Her mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. No sound coming out. She looked down the aisle toward Simone, suddenly seeing her not as that difficult passenger, but as the axis on which her entire world had just pivoted. A pregnant black woman in 1A, who happened to be Mrs. Marcus Thorne. Simone didn't gloat. She didn't even look back. She remained still, eyes closed, hand over her stomach, as if the turbulence had already passed. But deep inside, she felt a shift. The reclaiming of space, of dignity, of presence. She hadn't shouted, hadn't fought. She had simply stood firm, and the world had adjusted accordingly. In the rear of the plane, Karen sat down slowly in the jump seat, her hands trembling. The uniform that once made her feel untouchable now felt like a costume, an ill-fitting one. And for the first time in her long career, she realized that authority wasn't about barking orders or controlling passengers. It was about accountability. And that lesson had arrived at 35,000 feet, carried by the very airline she thought she controlled. The lights in the cabin dimmed slightly as meal service began, but Simone barely touched her tray. She wasn't hungry. Her body had softened into stillness, her mind finally catching up with the whirlwind of the past hour. The silence around her no longer felt isolating. It felt earned. It was the calm after the storm, the eye of resilience. She reached in her bag and pulled out a small photo, creased at the edges, worn from being touched too often. Her father, smiling beside her on her graduation day from Johns Hopkins, the same man waiting for her in a hospital bed across the ocean. She let her fingers trace the lines of his face, thinking not of what had just happened, but of everything that had led her here. Behind her, passengers whispered. The video had spread quietly but fast. A few rows back, someone gasped as they re-watched the moment on their phone. Not just the slap, but the aftermath. The truth, the shift in power. The woman in 1A was no longer anonymous. She was a name, a story, a reminder. Liam, still seated beside her, leaned over again. "It's gone viral," he said, tone somewhere between impressed and overwhelmed. "Like really viral. You're trending." Simone didn't even blink. "That's never the goal," she said softly. "But sometimes, silence only protects the wrong people." An hour before landing, Captain Rhodes returned. He didn't speak loudly or make a display, just approached her seat and said, "Aura's chairman would like to arrange a statement. They've asked if you'd be willing to speak, either now or once you've arrived in London." Simone looked up, her eyes calm but sharp. "Let's do it now," she said. They set up a simple recording at the front of the first-class cabin. Just her. No spotlight. No script. She didn't need one. The cabin crew stood quietly off-camera. Passengers watched from their seats, hushed. Simone looked straight into the lens. "My name is Dr. Simone Monroethorne. I'm a physician, a mother-to-be, and yes, the wife of the founder of this airline. But today, none of that was visible. Today, I was simply a woman asking for water. For safety. For dignity." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It was steady, resolute. What happened aboard this flight wasn't just a lapse in service. It was a reflection of something deeper, something many of us face in boardrooms and classrooms, on sidewalks, and yes, on airplanes. The assumption that we don't belong, that we must prove our right to occupy space. She paused. No one moved. Then she continued. "Let this not be just a headline or trending clip. Let it be a reminder that power can't always be seen, but can always be felt. And that respect should never be something a person has to earn with a resume or a bloodline. It should be the default for all of us." The video ended there. No applause, no drama, just a long, collective breath that felt like the closing of a wound. When they landed at Heathrow, an Aura Air representative met her at the gate with a car ready to take her directly to the hospital. Simone thanked them quietly, then turned back for a moment. Liam waved goodbye from the cabin door. "Take care of that baby, Doc." She smiled. "You too, Liam. Take care of the truth." Hours later, as she sat by her father's bedside, her hand folded gently over his, a nurse knocked gently and entered the room. "Dr. Monroe, the airline press office just sent over the clip. They're calling it the first-class wake-up call." Simone smiled faintly. "Let them call what they want," she said. "All I ever wanted was to arrive."